So, it's 1960. The Cold War is the only game in town, and the CIA has a new hobby: overthrowing governments it doesn't like. Down in Cuba, a charismatic, bearded law school dropout named Fidel Castro had just kicked out a US-backed dictator. This was, to put it mildly, inconvenient for American business interests and the Eisenhower administration's sense of regional dominance. So, CIA Director Allen Dulles and his deputy Richard Bissell cooked up a plan. A beautifully simple, almost elegant plan, if your definition of elegant is doomed from the start. They decided to find a bunch of angry Cuban exiles in Miami, give them some guns, a little training, and just see what happens. Plausible deniability was the name of the game, a concept where everyone knows you did it, but you can technically say you didn't. It's like a geopolitical version of "I wasn't touching you." Enter John F. Kennedy, fresh-faced and trying to project strength after winning the presidency by the slimmest of margins. On his desk, he finds this plan, a ticking package of bad ideas left over from the last guy. The CIA, oozing confidence, assured him it was a slam dunk. They claimed Castro was deeply unpopular, and that the moment Brigade 2506, that's the official name for our band of exiles, hit the beach, the Cuban people would rise up in a glorious wave of revolution. It's a lovely thought, except they based this assessment mostly on talking to other wealthy Cuban exiles in Miami, not exactly an unbiased sample. Kennedy, worried about looking soft on communism and surrounded by military brass telling him this was foolproof, hesitated. He tweaked the plan just enough to make it worse, moving the landing site from the more accessible Trinidad to a remote, swampy hellscape called the Bahía de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. Let's talk about the geography, because it's poetic. The Bay of Pigs is basically a giant, soggy marsh. The CIA's own intelligence reports describe the beach as leading into 80 miles of impenetrable swamp. This was presented as a feature, not a bug. The logic was, if the main invasion failed, the brigade could just melt into the mountains to wage a guerrilla war. One small problem: the Escambray Mountains, the only viable option, were 80 miles away. 80 miles of swamp. It wasn't a fallback plan, it was a death sentence by mosquito. And the beach itself? The CIA analysts somehow missed the razor-sharp coral reefs just under the water, which would proceed to rip the hulls out of the landing craft. It was the tactical equivalent of planning a surprise party, but getting the address, date, and guest of honor completely wrong. A key part of any successful invasion is controlling the sky. The CIA's plan for this was creative. They took a handful of obsolete World War II-era B-26 bombers, painted them to look like Cuban Air Force planes, and planned a series of strikes to wipe out Castro's tiny air force on the ground. On April 15th, 2 days before the invasion, they launched their first strike. It was a spectacular failure. They only managed to destroy a few of Castro's planes, leaving most of his operational T-33 jets and Sea Fury fighters intact. Worse, the disguise fooled absolutely no one. One of the defecting pilots landed in Miami, but his cover story fell apart in about 5 minutes when reporters noticed the plane's machine guns had clearly been fired. The whole plausible deniability thing was already in flames before the first boot hit the beach. The night of the invasion, April 16th, was a symphony of incompetence. The command ship, the Marsopa, was supposed to guide the whole operation. Unfortunately, the frogmen tasked with marking the landing zones with lights got lost. When they finally set up the markers, they used the wrong beach. So now the main force was heading for the wrong place. To make things even better, Castro's militia spotted the fleet almost immediately. Why? Because the ships, in a stunning display of operational security, had left all their lights on. As the landing craft, already damaged by the coral reefs no one planned for, struggled toward the shore, they were met not by cheering crowds, but by machine gun fire. The element of surprise had been well and truly lost, probably somewhere back in a planning meeting in Washington. By dawn on April 17th, Brigade 2506 was pinned down on the beach, and things were about to get much, much worse. They desperately needed air support to deal with Castro's planes, which were now happily strafing them. A second B-26 strike was planned, launching from a secret base in Nicaragua. And here we have one of the most sublime failures in military history. The planners in Washington forgot to account for the 1-hour time difference between Nicaragua and Cuba. The bombers arrived an hour late. By the time they got there, the U.S. jet fighters from the USS Essex, which were supposed to provide cover, had already completed their patrol and left. The slow, lumbering B-26 arrived over the beach completely alone and were promptly shot out of the sky by Castro's superior jets. The entire invasion was kneecapped by a failure to understand how clocks work. Meanwhile, how was Fidel Castro handling this existential threat to his revolution? By being a surprisingly effective commander-in-chief. Far from panicking, he took personal command of the counterattack. He understood his own terrain and his own forces. While the CIA was expecting a peasant uprising, Castro was rolling out his heavy armor, including Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, which were more than a match for the brigade's light weaponry. He established air superiority with the handful of planes the CIA had failed to destroy. He ordered 20,000 militiamen to converge on the beachhead, sealing it off completely. The CIA had fundamentally misread their adversary, viewing him as a tin-pot dictator when he was, in fact, a skilled tactician with immense popular support and a home field advantage. Back on the beach, morale was cratering. The brigade's supply ships, the Houston and the Ro Escondido, were critical. The Houston was hit by a Sea Fury fighter and had to be beached, losing most of its supplies. The Ro Escondido, carrying the bulk of the ammunition, food, and communication equipment, was also hit and sank in deep water. Within hours, the invasion force was cut off, outgunned, and running out of bullets. Their paratroopers, dropped in the wrong place, were isolated and quickly captured. The promised popular uprising never materialized. Not a single Cuban civilian joined them. It turns out that landing in a foreign-sponsored military force doesn't automatically make you a liberator in the eyes of the local populace. Who knew? As the situation spiraled, the White House descended into a state of controlled panic. President Kennedy, watching his first major foreign policy initiative implode in real time, made the fateful decision to cut his losses. He refused to authorize any further overt U.S. military involvement. No more airstrikes from the Essex, no U.S. Marines. The entire premise was plausible deniability, and that was already shot. Doubling down now would risk open war with the Soviet Union. For the men of Brigade 2506, this was the ultimate betrayal. They had been trained by the U.S., funded by the U.S., and sent into battle with the implicit promise of U.S. support. That support never came. The CIA's grand covert operation ended not with a bang, but with a series of frantic, denied phone calls. After just 72 hours of fighting, it was over. Out of nearly 1,400 invaders, 114 were killed and 1,202 were captured. Castro had won a total, unambiguous victory. The captured members of Brigade 2506 were paraded on Cuban television, a massive propaganda coup for Castro. He personally interrogated some of them, turning the defeat into a masterclass in political theater. For the United States and the Kennedy administration, it was a foreign policy humiliation of the highest order. A superpower had been thoroughly beaten by a small island nation it had dismissed and underestimated at every turn. The failure was so complete, so multifaceted, that it almost looks like it was designed that way. So, what happens to over 1,000 captured CIA-trained operatives? You pay for them, of course. After a series of show trials, Castro announced his price for their freedom: $53 million. Not in cash, but in food, tractors, and medicine for the Cuban people. The Kennedy administration, unable to officially pay a ransom, helped facilitate a private fundraising campaign. A committee, led by people like Eleanor Roosevelt's daughter, scrambled to gather the funds and supplies. So, in the end, the U.S. government sponsored an illegal invasion, failed spectacularly, and then paid reparations to the very government it tried to overthrow. It's an outcome so ironic, it feels like it was written by a satirist. The Bay of Pigs was an unmitigated disaster. It solidified Castro's power, pushed him firmly into the arms of the Soviet Union, and made the U.S. look both foolish and weak. But there is a strange, terrifying silver lining. The experience profoundly changed John F. Kennedy. It taught him to never again blindly trust the advice of his military and intelligence chiefs. Just 1 year later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when those same advisors were pushing for airstrikes and an invasion of Cuba, a course of action that could have triggered nuclear war, Kennedy remembered the Bay of Pigs. He resisted their advice, opting for a blockade and diplomacy instead. So, in a twisted, horrifying way, the complete and utter failure of this one ridiculous plan might just be one of the reasons the world didn't end in 1962. A comforting thought, isn't it? If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!